This cannot be happening. Look at her.
Which one will she choose?
By the age of 29, Lady Eleanor Hartwell had become something of a curiosity in London society. Not because she was scandalous, not because she was poor, and certainly not because she lacked beauty. In truth, Eleanor possessed the kind of beauty that often grew more striking with time. Her features were elegant rather than fashionable, her smile warm rather than dazzling, and there was a quiet grace about her that made people feel at ease within moments of meeting her. Yet none of those qualities were what people discussed when her name appeared in conversation. Instead, they talked about a single question that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Why had no one ever asked her to marry them? At 19, Eleanor had found the question embarrassing. At 23, she had found it hurtful. By 29, she had simply grown tired of hearing it. The latest reminder came during an afternoon gathering hosted by Lady Ashbury, whose drawing room had become a favorite meeting place for women who considered gossip a respectable. The room itself was beautiful, flooded with sunlight from towering windows, and filled with fresh flowers arranged in expensive porcelain vases. Elegant ladies sat upon velvet chairs sipping tea while discussing engagements, weddings, inheritances, and every other subject that might eventually become someone else's misfortune. Eleanor had attended only because declining would have created even more conversation than appearing. She sat quietly near the edge of the room, listening rather than speaking, perfectly aware that her presence was being discussed long before anyone finally gathered the courage to do so aloud. The first comment came from a baron's wife. Surely there must have been a proposal at some point. If there had been, we would all know about it. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the garden outside the window. Years earlier, she might have attempted to defend herself. Now she understood something important. People who enjoyed gossip rarely wanted answers. They only wanted entertainment. Across the room sat her younger half-sister, Sophia, who seemed to attract attention as naturally as flowers attracted sunlight. At 22, Sophia was everything society adored. She was beautiful, charming, fashionable, and blessed with the remarkable ability to make every room revolve around her without appearing to try. At least, that was what most people believed. Eleanor knew better. She had spent 15 years watching Sophia perfect the art of becoming the center of every conversation. Sophia lowered her teacup and offered the room an innocent smile. Perhaps there was a proposal once. The possibility of hidden romance was far more exciting than simple failure. Sophia glanced toward Eleanor. Although, if there was, I imagine he must have changed his mind. One woman nearly choked on her tea. The remark was cruel enough to sting and gentle enough to be excused as a joke. It was exactly the sort of thing Sophia excelled at. For a brief moment, Eleanor felt every eye in the room shift toward her, waiting, watching, hoping for a reaction, but she simply smiled. Not because the comment did not hurt, but because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing that it did. If that happened, she said calmly, I can only hope he found someone more suitable. Sophia's smile flickered for the briefest moment. Then it returned, polished, perfect, and entirely false. The conversation soon moved on, but the damage had already been done. Eleanor spent the remainder of the afternoon enduring sympathetic looks from strangers and triumphant looks from her sister. By the time she finally escaped the gathering and stepped into her carriage, exhaustion had settled deep inside her chest. The truth was that society had created an entire story about her life without ever asking for the facts. People assumed she had never received offers because no one wanted her. People assumed there must be some hidden flaw. People assumed she had somehow failed. What they did not know was that Eleanor had made a choice many years ago. When her father's death left the family struggling and her mother's health began to decline, every decision suddenly became simple. There were medicines to purchase, doctors to visit, bills to manage, and long nights spent beside a sickbed, listening for every change in breathing. While other young women attended balls and searched for husbands, Eleanor found herself measuring medicine, writing letters, and learning how to care for a woman whose strength seemed to fade a little more with every passing year. There had been opportunities. Not many, but enough. A kind schoolmaster had once asked for her hand. A widower with 2 young daughters had offered her a comfortable future. Even a young doctor had courted her for nearly a year. Each time Eleanor faced the same impossible choice, leave her mother or stay. She stayed, again and again. Until eventually the opportunities disappeared. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. And before she realized it, society had already decided who she was, the woman nobody wanted, the spinster. The cautionary tale whispered about by ambitious mothers. The irony was almost amusing. Because the people who pitied her most had no idea how much of her life had been spent loving someone else. As the carriage rolled through London's crowded streets, Eleanor rested her head against the window and closed her eyes. For the first time all afternoon, the laughter from Lady Ashbury's drawing room began to fade. Home was waiting. And unlike society, home had never asked her to prove her worth. When Eleanor arrived home that afternoon, the familiar silence of the Hartwell residence felt different somehow. It was not the peaceful silence she had grown accustomed to during the years spent caring for her mother. It carried a weight she could not quite explain, as though the old house itself sensed that time was running out. The maid who opened the door greeted her with a worried expression and Eleanor knew immediately that something had changed. "Has the doctor come?" she asked before even removing her gloves. The maid nodded. "He is upstairs with your mother now." Without another word, she gathered her skirts and hurried toward the staircase. The doctor emerged from Lady Margaret's room just as Eleanor reached the landing. He was a kind man who had treated her mother for years, but today there was a sadness in his eyes that frightened her more than any diagnosis he could have spoken aloud. He bowed politely. "Lady Eleanor. She is asking for you." When Eleanor entered the room, she found her mother resting against a collection of pillows near the window. The late afternoon sunlight poured softly across the bed, illuminating the silver strands that had gradually overtaken her once dark hair. Lady Margaret smiled when she saw her daughter. "There you are." Even after all these years, the touch felt reassuring. Yet today it was also frighteningly weak. Eleanor sat beside the bed and adjusted the blanket around her mother's shoulders. "You should be resting." For a few moments, they spoke about ordinary things. The weather. The garden. The roses that would soon bloom. Neither mentioned the truth standing quietly between them. Finally, Lady Margaret turned her gaze toward the window. "Eleanor." "Yes. Of course." That confidence came rather late. "You don't need to talk like this." And suddenly Eleanor felt like a child again. A frightened girl sitting beside the one person who had always loved her without condition. "I need you to hear me." She already knew where this conversation was going. She simply wasn't ready for it. "I am listening." "You gave me 10 years. 10 years that should have belonged to you. You stayed every single time. Every chance at a different future she had chosen her mother. And she had never regretted it, not once. But hearing it spoken aloud somehow made the sacrifice feel real in a way it never had before. "I wanted to stay. My sweet girl. You have spent half your life caring for everyone else. You deserve someone who will care for you." At 29 years old, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to imagine a future that belonged to herself. Marriage had become something that happened to other women. Children belonged to other women. Grand love stories belonged to other women. Not because she lacked the desire, but because life had slowly taught her not to expect them. Her mother seemed to understand exactly what she was thinking. "When I am gone." Because speaking the promise aloud would make everything too real. Eventually she whispered. The kind that somehow made Eleanor even more afraid. 3 days later, Lady Margaret Hartwell passed away quietly in her sleep. The house felt empty afterward. Not physically, emotionally. The rooms remained exactly as they had always been. The furniture stood in the same places. The clocks continued ticking. The curtains still swayed gently whenever the windows were opened. And yet everything felt different. For the first time in nearly a decade, Eleanor woke each morning with nobody needing her. No medicine to prepare. No doctor's visits to arrange. No blankets to adjust during the night. No voice calling her name from the next room. The freedom she had imagined for so many years felt strangely hollow. As though someone had finally opened a cage only for her to discover she no longer remembered how to fly. The funeral passed quietly. A few old friends attended. Several distant relatives appeared out of obligation. Sophia arrived dressed in elegant black silk that somehow managed to draw attention even in mourning. By the end of the service, Eleanor noticed more people discussing Sophia's beauty than her mother's life. Some things never changed. A week later, the house felt even quieter. Eleanor spent most mornings walking through the garden her mother had loved. She read. She sorted old letters. She tried to imagine what came next. For the first time in years, there was no responsibility forcing her forward. Only uncertainty. One rainy morning, she stood among the rose bushes, staring at the grey sky when hurried footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. One of the maids was practically running across the garden. Lady Eleanor. At first, she assumed it must be a solicitor. Or perhaps a distant relative. Nothing unusual. Then she noticed the maid's expression. No one looked that shocked over a solicitor. What kind of visitor? A duke. Why would a duke visit the Hartwell estate? And more importantly, why would he visit her? Curious and confused, she followed the maid toward the front of the house. The moment she stepped into the entrance hall, she noticed something unusual. People were gathering. Neighbors, shopkeepers, children. Half the street appeared to be staring at the Hartwell residence. Eleanor approached the window. Then she saw it. A magnificent black carriage bearing the crest of the Hawthorne family stood before the gates. Her breath caught. Everyone in England knew that crest, Duke William Hawthorne. One of the most respected noblemen in the kingdom. Before she could fully process the sight, the carriage door opened. William stepped out. Tall. Distinguished, dressed impeccably despite the rain. The crowd immediately erupted into whispers. Eleanor stood frozen. She had met the Duke only twice in her life. Neither encounter had lasted longer than a few minutes. Yet now he was walking directly toward her house. Toward her. Moments later, the front door opened. The Duke entered. And his gaze settled immediately upon Eleanor. His expression softened. As though seeing someone he had been searching for. Lady Eleanor. Then, without hesitation, he said the last thing she expected to hear. I have come to ask for your hand in marriage. For several seconds, Eleanor genuinely wondered whether she had imagined the words. Outside, the crowd gasped loudly enough to be heard through the windows. Inside. The servants stared openly. No one moved. No one spoke. And before anyone could recover from the shock, another commotion erupted outside. The sound of approaching wheels. A second carriage. Larger. More luxurious. Bearing a crest so famous that even the neighbors immediately recognized it. The entire crowd turned. William turned. Even Eleanor turned. The second carriage rolled to a stop directly beside the first. Its door opened. And Duke Adrian Ashcroft stepped out. The richest duke in England. The most sought-after bachelor in the kingdom. The crowd fell into complete silence. Adrian's eyes found Eleanor through the open doorway. Then he smiled. Slowly. Knowingly. And said. Only moments earlier the entire street had been struggling to comprehend why Duke William Hawthorne, a widowed nobleman respected throughout England, had appeared at the Hartwell residence and calmly announced his intention to marry a woman whom society had spent years dismissing. That shock alone would have been enough to fuel gossip for months. Now a second duke had stepped from another carriage, and declared that he had come for precisely the same. For several long seconds nobody seemed capable of speaking. The servants stood frozen in the entrance hall. Curious neighbors crowded the iron fence outside the property, straining to hear every word. Even Duke William's expression had hardened slightly as he watched Adrian approach the house. Eleanor herself felt as though the ground beneath her feet had become unsteady. She knew who Adrian Ashcroft was, of course. Every person in England knew his name. His estates stretched across multiple counties. Newspapers followed his movements. Mothers dreamed of marrying their daughters into his family. For nearly 15 years, he had been one of the most sought-after bachelors in the kingdom. And yet, she could not remember ever having a proper conversation with him. The realization only deepened her confusion. Adrian entered the house with the confidence of a man accustomed to every door opening before he reached it. Rainwater glistened upon the shoulders of his dark coat. Though he appeared entirely unconcerned by the weather, his attention never wandered toward the servants, the gathering crowd, or even William Hawthorne. Instead, his eyes remained fixed upon Eleanor. It was not the gaze of a stranger. That was what unsettled her most. There was recognition there. As though he had expected to find her exactly where she was. As fascinating as this situation has become, William finally said, breaking the silence, I confess I was unaware that I would be competing for Lady Eleanor's hand today. A faint smile touched Adrian's lips. Neither was I. William studied him for a moment. Then he laughed quietly, well, at least we can agree that neither of us expected this. Eleanor looked from one duke to the other, still struggling to understand how any of this could possibly be happening. Just weeks earlier, she had been sitting alone beside her mother's bed, wondering what her future might look like after years of sacrifice. 3 days ago, she had been listening to women laugh about the fact that no man had ever proposed to her. Now 2 of the most powerful men in England stood inside her home discussing marriage as though such conversations belonged naturally in her life. Nothing about it felt real. I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding, she said at last. Both men turned toward her immediately. The simple movement made her wish she had remained silent. A misunderstanding? Adrian repeated. Yes. You are both speaking as though you know me. William was the first to answer. Perhaps that is because we do. William stepped forward, his expression softening. But I assure you that I would not have come here without careful thought. Nor would I. As though he had reached a decision long ago, Eleanor's confusion only deepened. She searched her memory desperately, trying to recall some forgotten encounter. Some moment that might explain why either man would be standing here. Nothing came. The only thing she knew with certainty was that neither proposal could possibly have anything to do with wealth, influence, or ambition. The Hartwell family possessed very little of any of those things. Which left a far more troubling question: what did they actually want? Outside, the crowd continued growing. Word had already begun spreading through the neighborhood. Eleanor could hear distant voices beyond the gates, hear carriage wheels stopping as newcomers arrived to witness whatever extraordinary event was unfolding. By sunset, half of London would probably know. By morning, all of it would. The thought exhausted her. For 10 years, society talked about her because no one wanted her. Now they would talk because apparently 2 dukes did. Neither version was true. And somehow she suspected the truth was only beginning to reveal itself. Then just as she opened her mouth to insist once more that there had been some terrible mistake, another servant hurried into the entrance hall looking even more alarmed than the first. The young man stopped abruptly when he saw the 2 dukes. His face lost all color. What is it? Eleanor asked. The servant swallowed. Then looked nervously toward the front door. My lady. There is another carriage approaching the house. And Eleanor suddenly had the terrifying feeling that her quiet life had just ended forever. The servant's announcement seemed to drain what little composure remained in the room. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at him, convinced she had misunderstood. 2 dukes arriving at her home on the same day already bordered on absurdity. The possibility of a third distinguished visitor felt less like reality and more like the sort of ridiculous story society invented after too much wine. Yet the servant's expression left little room for doubt. Outside, the noise from the street had grown noticeably. More people had gathered near the gates, and the murmur of excited voices drifted through the open like the distant roar of the sea. William Hawthorne walked toward the window first. Adrian followed a moment later. Neither man appeared particularly surprised. That detail did not escape Eleanor. "Please tell me neither of you expected this," she said quietly. William's mouth twitched. "I was hoping not to. Unfortunately, I know exactly whose carriage that is." The second Duke's arrival had been shocking. The third somehow felt dangerous. The carriage rolled to a stop beyond the gates. The crowd immediately parted. People recognized power when they saw it, and whoever sat inside that carriage clearly possessed plenty of it. The door opened. A tall figure stepped out. Unlike William, whose reputation was built upon kindness and duty, or Adrian, whose wealth had made him one of the most influential noblemen in England, Duke Nathaniel Blackwood carried a very different reputation. People admired him. People feared him. And very few people claimed to understand him. He was known for declining invitations from families who desperately wanted connections to his estate. He rarely attended society events longer than necessary and had spent years ignoring every attempt to arrange a suitable marriage for him. Mothers whispered about him constantly. Daughters dreamed about him. Most men preferred not to cross him. And now he was walking directly toward the Hartwell residence. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. This cannot possibly be happening. It probably shouldn't be. Unlike the other two dukes, he offered no immediate explanation and made no effort to soften the absurdity of the situation. His gaze swept briefly across the room before settling upon Eleanor. The silence that followed felt oddly intimate despite the number of people present. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Nathaniel bowed. Not deeply, not theatrically, but with genuine respect. "Lady Eleanor, I apologize for arriving without warning." Today it was impossible not to notice the irony. Adrian laughed first, William followed. Even Eleanor found herself fighting the urge to smile. "You apologize for arriving without warning?" Adrian asked. "You chose a remarkable day to develop manners. You are one to talk." Unfortunately, it did nothing to explain why all three of them were standing inside her home. Finally, Eleanor decided she had endured enough confusion. "Would someone please explain what is happening?" It was William who spoke first. Perhaps because he seemed to be the only one aware of how overwhelmed she felt. "You deserve honesty, Lady Eleanor. My daughter talks about you constantly." For a moment, she thought she had misheard William's daughter. The little girl he rarely brought to public events. The connection made no sense. Seeing her confusion, William continued. 3 years ago, my daughter attended a small school near one of my estates. She struggled after losing her mother and had become withdrawn to the point that even her tutors could not reach her. William nodded when recognition appeared on her face. "You spent nearly 6 months helping her. She still keeps the first book you gave her." She simply had never imagined the gesture mattered so much. William's gaze remained steady. "When my daughter learned of your mother's passing, she cried. Then she asked me why a woman as kind as you was always alone." Somehow that question hurt more coming from a child than it ever had from society, William continued. "I did not have an answer. Eventually, I realized a different question perhaps I should have been asking." Unfortunately, before she could process any of it, Adrian cleared his throat. "A touching story. Please don't ruin the moment. I simply suspect my reason for being here is slightly older." Adrian walked slowly toward the fireplace. For a brief moment, he seemed uncertain how to begin. That alone surprised everyone. Few people had ever seen Duke Adrian Ashcroft uncertain about anything. Finally, he looked at Eleanor. 7 years ago, there was an accident on the northern road outside Ashford. "I see you remember." No. She remembered running toward the wreck. She remembered hearing people shouting. She remembered someone warning her not to get closer. Most of all, she remembered a badly injured stranger trapped inside a burning carriage. A stranger she had helped pull free before the fire spread. She had never learned his name. Never asked. Never expected to see him again. Adrian's eyes never left hers. You disappeared before I regained consciousness. I didn't know who you were. You never left a name. Inside, Eleanor felt as though the world she had known for 10 years was slowly unraveling. For years, society had looked at her and seen a woman nobody wanted. For years people had laughed at her, pitied her, and treated her like a cautionary tale. Yet sitting before her were two men whose lives had been touched by hers long before she ever realized it. And somehow she sensed the most surprising revelation had not yet arrived. Because throughout the entire conversation, Duke Nathaniel Blackwood had remained silent. Watching. Waiting. As though his reason for coming was something far more difficult to explain. And when Eleanor finally turned toward him, she saw an expression in his eyes that neither William nor Adrian possessed. Recognition. Not from years ago. Not from a single encounter. But from someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. For several moments, neither Eleanor nor Nathaniel spoke. The silence felt different from the ones that had come before. William's story had carried warmth. Adrian's had carried surprise. But whatever reason Nathaniel Blackwood had for standing in, her home seemed to carry something else entirely. Something deeper. Something older. Nathaniel remained near the window, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair. His expression unreadable in the fading afternoon light. Unlike the other two dukes, he did not appear eager to explain himself. In fact, he looked almost reluctant. That alone made Eleanor uneasy. She had spent enough time around society to know that hesitation often concealed truths people were not entirely comfortable sharing. Your Grace, she said gently, I believe I am owed an explanation as well. I suppose you are. By now, half the city was likely discussing what had happened at the Hartwell residence. Yet inside the drawing room, the world seemed to narrow until only a handful of people remained. Nathaniel's gaze settled on the fireplace before returning to Eleanor. You once told a grieving widow that loneliness becomes easier when someone is willing to sit beside you. The statement caught her completely off guard. I did. 8 years ago. She searched her memory and found nothing. Over the years, she had volunteered at schools, hospitals, churches, and charitable societies whenever time allowed. She had spoken to hundreds of people. Some she remembered. Many she did not. The realization seemed to amuse Nathaniel slightly. You don't remember? It wasn't an important moment to you. My older sister died that year. She had never heard Nathaniel speak publicly about his family. Almost nobody had. I didn't know. When she died, her husband stopped leaving the house. He stopped attending dinners. Stopped speaking to friends. Stopped living, if I'm being honest. One afternoon, you happened to visit a charity event where he had been persuaded to appear. A conversation near a garden wall. Nathaniel saw recognition begin to form. You sat with him for nearly an hour. She remembered a widower who had lost his wife. A man surrounded by people offering sympathy while somehow making his grief worse. She remembered sitting beside him because no one else seemed willing to stop talking long enough to listen. Nothing more. At least nothing she had considered important. Nathaniel studied her expression carefully. You never introduced yourself. Then how do you know it was me? Because my brother-in-law spent the next 6 months trying to find the woman who had spoken to him like a human being instead of a tragedy. Even Adrian smiled at that. William shook his head. I admit I wasn't expecting that story. But he recovered enough to raise his children. Enough to continue living. And he never forgot the woman who sat beside him when everyone else was too busy offering advice. A strange mixture of emotions moved through her chest. She had spent years believing her life had accomplished very little beyond caring for her mother. Yet one after another, these men kept describing moments she barely remembered. And attaching significance to them she had never intended. The realization felt overwhelming. Because if they were right, then perhaps the last 10 years had not been as invisible as she thought. Nathaniel seemed to sense exactly what she was feeling. They remember dramatic speeches, public victories, or acts designed to attract attention. Very few remember ordinary kindness. Yet in my experience, ordinary kindness lives far more often. This time, however, the silence felt warmer. Almost comforting. Then Adrian leaned back in his chair. Well. No. He looked between the three of them before settling on Eleanor. Lady Eleanor, it occurs to me that we have created a highly unusual situation. Highly unusual. Regardless, I believe all three of us can agree on one thing. That Lady Eleanor is unlikely to accept any proposal made today. Then, despite everything that had happened, she laughed properly for the first time in months. The sound surprised everyone, most of all herself, because it felt good, natural, free. When the laughter faded, she looked at the three men seated before her and finally said the only honest thing she could. I don't even know what I feel. No one attempted to convince her otherwise. William nodded thoughtfully. That seems reasonable. You lost your mother less than a month ago, Adrian added. If anyone expects immediate decisions, they are idiots. A surprisingly wise observation. For the first time in years, she was no longer being judged for what her life lacked. No one was asking why she had never married. No one was whispering about her age. Instead, three men who could have chosen almost any woman in England were speaking to her. As though her thoughts mattered. As though her choices mattered. As though she mattered. And perhaps that was what frightened her most. Because after spending so many years believing her future had already passed her by, Eleanor suddenly found herself standing at the beginning of something entirely unexpected. Outside, the rain began to ease. Inside, the conversation continued long into the evening. But none of them noticed that another carriage had quietly arrived at the edge of the street. And inside that carriage sat someone who was far less pleased about Eleanor Hartwell's sudden change in fortune than the three dukes gathered in her drawing room, Sophia Hartwell. And by the expression on her face, she had no intention of allowing her sister to enjoy this attention for long.